As movies come to rely more and more on franchises and interconnectivity, it's almost a given that the stories being told would start becoming more and more complex. But considering the majority of people aren't movie buffs and only occasionally go to the theater as a recreational activity, the overly complicated nature of modern movies is noted to not be a very appealing one. Because let's face it, how many normal people will go and see a movie that requires them to have seen 3 other movies and 2 TV shows in order to properly understand? Frankly, most would be apt to just skip over it entirely in favor of something less demanding, which is exactly what happened. And because of this, many would argue that movies were much better when they took a simpler approach to telling their stories, as it was a lot easier to get audiences invested in them. And today, I'd like to explore this topic and see if there's something to that argument. Have movies become way too complicated for their own good? And there will be spoilers for pretty much anything I bring up ahead. So in case there's something you've been meaning to see and don't want to know how it ends, you might want to remain on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so as I've already noted in plenty of other videos, Hollywood's refusal to take risks on new and original ideas has caused them to start relying more and more on existing franchises and IPs in order to get audiences to see their films. And due to the overwhelming success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which built itself around having every single movie be interconnected and directly affecting each other, many other studios tried copying the same format in search of guaranteed profits. The only problem was that not only were most of these attempts nowhere near as good as early Marvel was, but the audience quickly got tired of everything being connected to each other and always building towards something else. Because that was okay when just Marvel was doing it, both for the novelty factor and because they actually did a good job at it. But when everybody was doing it, it quickly got old because audiences didn't have the time or patience to keep up with everything. But even more than that, a lot of these stories became less about actually trying to tell a story and more about trying to set up what would come after it so that audiences would get excited and come back for the next thing. But once again, they overestimated how much most average people love movies. And that, combined with these stories being poorly told as a result of caring more about how long they could string out a crossover out than the actual plot, gave audiences nothing to be excited for. Now, I got a bit more into this topic in my video on the history of TV, which you can find a link in the description to, but the point is that movies went from being an experience that audiences could fully immerse themselves in to something that's constantly trying to sell the next new thing, and it quickly got way too complicated for most people to follow or remain interested in. And when you compare that to how movies were made in the past, it's really no wonder why audiences haven't taken to that approach. As I even explained in my video on Smokey and the Bandit, which you can also find a link in the description to, that was a film that was made simply to give the audience a fun time, and became such a favorite for many people because it succeeded in that task. It's a breezy 90 minutes of car chases and funny one-liners from the entire cast. And part of the reason it's so well liked is because it doesn't ask anything from the viewer. The movie was there for the audience. The audience isn't supposed to be there for the movie by watching a ton of other content in order to understand what's going on. Because as I keep pointing out, most people just don't have the patience for that. They turn to entertainment to unwind, not to have to do so much work and mental gymnastics for nothing. And if you take it back even further to the golden age of Hollywood, most movies were exactly what they needed to be. Both creatives and studio executives understood what audiences did and didn't have tolerances for, and rarely tried to demand anything more of them. Like, for example, if you go back to the Universal horror movies of the 1930s, you'll find that most of them have very self-contained stories that start and end in a maximum of an hour and 20 minutes. And that worked a lot better because it allowed them to set up the basic plot, tell its story while scaring the audience as much as possible, and roll the credits. And one has to admit, even if they could have been a bit longer, that's honestly a lot more engaging than 3 hours of constant action that expects you to have seen stuff beforehand, as well as see the countless sequels and spin-offs that are already in production to know how it ends. These movies had to stand on their own merits, and thus were a lot more accommodating to the audience as a result. Though, sure, Universal did release sequels to a lot of their horror movies, but the point is that the original didn't rely on them, nor do these sequels taint the original if they weren't as good. To put it another way, sequels were made because the original was good, not because it spent the whole runtime trying to advertise its follow-up. But to give a more specific example of what I'm talking about here, take the 1954 horror classic Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is simply the tale of a group of scientists trying to uncover an important fossil for research purposes, only to be stalked and killed off one by a still living member of the same species. And honestly, there isn't much more to it than that. The scientists try to figure out how to stay alive and beat the creature, while it sets its sights on the only female of the group, since, being the last of its kind, it has no mate of its own. And it's in that, the fact that it doesn't try to be anything more than it is, that makes it the classic it is today. If they had tried to stretch the script out to 2 hours and filled it with a bunch of boring exposition on what was known about evolution and science at the time in a vain attempt to be seen as smart or important, it would have been almost immediately forgotten. Instead, the only place where it tries to be a bit deeper is in the depiction of the creature itself, as it's portrayed as a lonely being with the instincts of an animal nonetheless, and thus is worthy of some sympathy. And because of that, the movie is able to stand on its own merits and benefits heavily from the simple nature of its story. It's not a demanding one to engage in, which majorly adds to its appeal. And this isn't something that just applies to older movies either, because as I explained in my video on the Mario movie, which you can also find a link in the description to, a major reason the film works and was so well liked is that it doesn't take the complex approach that most other video game movies do. It glosses over all of the potential complicated details, lore, and world-building aspects in favor of telling its story, which is also a fairly basic one when you get right down to it. The movie explains just enough for the audience to understand what's going on and how everything works, but beyond that is just trying to have fun. And as I argued in the aforementioned video, the movie was much better off for it. It didn't demand anything of its audience, and thus the audience took to it like a fish to water. And once again, nowadays it's very easy to go back to the golden age of Hollywood and appreciate just how well they actually understood this concept. And Creature from the Black Lagoon is only one example of that. Frankly, I could go over hundreds of films of the time that fit the same molding. The 1953 musical The Bandwagon even addresses this issue head-on, with an ambitious theater director taking a simple, fun musical and turning it into a dark, complex drama about a man who sells his soul to the devil. And it ends up being a disaster because it's too dark, boring, and complex for anyone to understand. So as a result, they decide to change it back to what it was meant to be, a simple, fun, undemanding musical, and only then do they find major success. Because in the end, the story they were telling fit a much simpler and fun approach a lot better, and there's nothing wrong with that. And going along with this, One thing I've learned from my days of writing books is that the easier it is for audiences to understand something, the less likely they are to lose interest in it. And that's what Hollywood has forgotten. Because, for example, when something poses a threat to the entire multiverse, it can be difficult for people to comprehend what that even means. I mean, people have issues imagining 100 balloons. How are they supposed to comprehend destruction on that kind of scale? Though, to be fair, stakes of that magnitude are a lot easier to understand in something like Deadpool and Wolverine, but that's only because it gives the audience a point of reference. It tells the audience, here's a bunch of universes, here's the void, and the villain wants to destroy everything but the void. So, as a result, they can get their heads around what's really at stake a bit better because they know what won't be destroyed if she succeeds. But at the same time, the best stakes are still the ones that are easiest to understand. Even something as trivial as trying to return a library book on time because you can't pay the fine can get people much more invested depending on how well it's told, because they can fully understand what that person is going through and the consequences if they fail. As the old saying goes, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And in a way that is true because people do have a hard time comprehending that much carnage to the point that it almost becomes trivial. Sometimes less is indeed more, and it can be the little things that carry a lot more dramatic weight because the audience has a much easier time understanding them. And on that topic, a similar problem is how long a lot of movies have become. Because to put it simply, most audiences don't have the attention span to sit and engage in a film for 3 hours unless it's telling a story worthy of such a length, which many aren't. And once again, this was something that was understood a lot better during the golden age of Hollywood, as the previous movies I went over even demonstrate. They knew their limitations as far as audience engagement would go and thus made their movies an appropriate length to accommodate them. This is even why they say comedies in particular shouldn't be longer than 100 minutes, because with few exceptions, audiences will get bored if the plot is dragged out for too long. And on the flip side, they also understood when it was important for a movie to be on the long side in order for the story to be told in its entirety. And you notice that 3-hour plus movies during the golden age of Hollywood tended to be very well received and were even considered among the best of the best? That was because not only was such long-form entertainment used more sparingly, but those movies were only as long as they were because that's how long they needed to be. And indeed, there were even a few cases of longer movies being cut down to a more watchable length and ended up suffering for it. And one of the best examples of that would have to be the 1944 drama An American Romance, detailing the life of an immigrant who comes to the US and goes from a factory worker to founding his own successful airplane company, all the while falling in love, marrying, and watching his children carry on his business. This movie was originally envisioned by director King Vidor as his masterpiece, but he felt that two things ended up holding it back. The first was his inability to cast Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman in the lead roles. But the second, and more prominent reason, was that it was originally filmed to be 2.5 hours long, and the studio wanted it cut down to 2 hours. But instead of cutting all the scenes that showcased the building of materials, which had no bearing on the plot, they cut out parts of the actual story for, quote, soundtrack reasons. And as a result, the movie suffered from not being able to tell its complete story. To this day, the original cut of the movie has never been released, but it's believed by many film historians, which I'd like to point out I am not, that Vidor's cut would have made for a much better movie. So the point here is, during the golden age of Hollywood, movies were generally as long as they needed to be, and didn't often bloat their run times trying to stuff as much content into them as possible. So by now you might be wondering, what exactly am I trying to get at here? That the biggest problem a lot of movies suffer from in the modern age can be summed up in just one sentence: a lack of simplicity. Whether through trying to shove too much lore down the audience's throat, trying to make the stakes so unimaginably high that they can't even comprehend them anymore, or by simply making their movies too long, too much is being asked of an audience that honestly just wants to be entertained for a little while. And once again, this is something that was understood a lot better in decades past, when movies only gave out information as needed, played into the more human side of people, whatever that might entail, and stories were only as long as they needed to be, whether that be 1 hour or 4. Now, some might argue that movies have gotten more complex because they're treating the audience as more intelligent than in years past. But that's not really what's going on here. Because this isn't about the viewer being too stupid to understand what's going on. It's more that most people watching don't want to put in the effort to understand something so complex when it's all just a work of fiction. I mean, as a movie lover myself, I hate to say that, but that's the reality of it. Most people go to watch movies for either the fun or art, not to carefully dissect the lore behind a science that doesn't even exist. And as a result, movies that dive headfirst into this sort of thing can often come across as being wrapped up in their own self-importance, rather than trying to engage in an intelligent discussion with the viewer. World building is a great thing, but a good writer is one who knows when and where to use it. Now, sure, maybe some of those earlier movies did sometimes treat their audiences slightly on the slow side, but if nothing else, it made it easier for them to understand what was going on. Because saying that a monster is an ancient creature, or a reanimated corpse brought back to life through undiscovered light beams, or the result of an experiment gone wrong, that's much easier to get your head around than where some of these things come from in modern movies. And in the same vein, them killing people indiscriminately is a much more tangible problem to understand than all of existence constantly being on the line. What I'm trying to say here is, a lot of modern movies have become overly complex in a vain attempt to look smart, and all they've ended up doing is confusing everybody. And because they're so bent on being taken seriously, they're also hesitant to be out and out fun like they used to, which is really the whole point of entertainment in the first place. Honestly, the best thing Hollywood could do at this point is take a few pages out of the way they used to do things and make their films easy on the viewer again. And also abandon their attempts at cinematic universes. They've become way too complicated to enjoy anymore. After all, what's the point of trying to engage in a story if you can't even understand what's going on? Sometimes, the simplest stories are the ones that speak to the most people in the best ways. Okay, I think that ends this video. So now it's your turn to tell me. Do you believe that a lack of movies taking a more simple approach to storytelling is having a negative effect on them? Or do you prefer the more complicated structure of modern film? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel about this or any other subject that you want to. And that is most definitely your right. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.